Our keynote speaker this morning is, I think, the perfect person to address these changes that we're seeing. CEO of Biogen Idec, George Scangos, of course, is a veteran of this industry, and of course, he has deep ties here in California, and especially here in the Bay Area with the life science community. Of course, George is the former CEO of Exelixis, and he was an active player here in the cluster here in the Bay Area, former member of the Bay Bio board, and also of the CHI board. We, of course, in Southern California are familiar with George's company, Biogen Idec, because of its predecessor, Idec, being the company that commercialized Rituxan. And I'll never forget back in 1999, going out to the driveway and opening the newspaper to find on the front page the story about Idec getting Rituxan approved and how proud we were. But Biogen Idec is also very important because of another key product, which goes to the whole theme of this conference today. Several multiple sclerosis foundations, of course, attending today will agree that this is a perfect example of a life science company that has embraced the patient community. And I'm talking, of course, about the product Tysabri, which is a model for companies everywhere of how to provide access to a life-saving therapy, working directly with patient groups and engaging with the FDA. And engaging in a way that we saw a drug that was pulled off the market, being put back on the market, because of the fact that there was a strong agreement between the patient community, the company, and the FDA to make this product work and to make it work in a way that was safe and efficacious. In his year and a half as CEO of Biogen Idec, George has offered a bold new vision for this leading independent biopharmaceutical company. Similarly, in his keynote speech this morning, George will share a new bold vision for our industry, after which we'll engage in a brief discussion, and that will be followed by your questions. So please take advantage of the cards that have been placed on the table to write your questions, and they'll be collected and given to me, and we'll have a chance to have George address those afterwards. So without any further delay, let me introduce George Scangos, PhD, CEO of Biogen Idec, for a talk about how reordering is in the works. George?
Thanks, sir. Ooh, pretty bright lights up here. Good morning, everybody. Look, my talk here began about a year ago, I guess, when Gail asked me if I would come out and do this. And the opportunity to come back to the Bay Area, especially on a Friday when I can spend the adjacent weekend here, was just too much to pass up. So I'm glad I'm here. Nice to be back home. What I want to talk about, there was something in the program I saw about broken business models and changing that, and I actually think that's the wrong terminology. I think the world in which we live in is evolving, and we have to evolve with it if we want to continue to be successful. So what I want to talk about is a little bit of where we are, what some of the opportunities are, what some of the issues are, some of the threats, and what we can do to help deal with them. Our lawyers, of course, want me to show you this. I will talk about the company and some of the remarks that I'll make, and of course, what this says is anything that hasn't happened yet might not happen. Okay. So let me talk about a few issues here. You know, we are in a time of amazing scientific and technological advances. Right? And those present for all of us in this room amazing opportunities to treat diseases for which there have currently been either no treatment or only partially effective treatment. So the opportunity is, I think, more exciting than it has ever been. Right? And we can think about treating diseases now that you couldn't even approach a few years ago. You know, the first Elan's antibody for Alzheimer's disease will read out sometime in the middle of this year, they said. Wasn't possible to develop a drug like that. I don't know if that trial will be positive or not, but it is the first in a wave of new drugs that are in clinical trials to treat Alzheimer's diseases. So why has that occurred? It's occurred because we know a little bit more about the disease, so you can start to design drugs that rationally will intervene in the process. Increasingly, imaging and non-invasive technologies to be able to follow the drug are to follow the patient and the course of therapy, and the impact of the drug are much more sophisticated than they used to be, and are still getting more and more sophisticated. That allows you to diagnose patients earlier. Alzheimer's as an example. You know, a few years ago, if you did an Alzheimer's trial, it wasn't even possible to be sure that all of the patients in your trial had Alzheimer's disease. They all had dementia of some sort. You could tell that, but you couldn't really tell the Alzheimer's patients from other forms of dementia. So if you have those patients in your trial and you have a drug that treats Alzheimer's disease that won't work on those other patients, that's a tall order, right? And that makes life really difficult. These days it is possible to tell early on in the disease whether a patient truly has Alzheimer's disease or not. Those are imaging technologies, and those are more sophisticated cognitive testing. That, coupled with the advance in the understanding of the disease, makes it possible now to address this disease, and that's just one example. Many diseases fall into those categories. That's what makes this such an exciting time. Okay, we have a lot of challenges, right? Now, you know, when I was at Exelixis for 14 years as a pre-commercial company, and I just want to point out to you, this is probably the only industry ever where you can have a pre-commercial company for 14 years, right? So, you know, and I'm not sure that's going to be true going forward, right? But it has been true up until, sorry. What do I have to do to get that back? Nope. Sorry, I use a Mac, so I don't know how to run this thing. Okay, thanks. To be careful what I touch. Okay, look, you know, in a company like that, you don't give too much thought about what's happening around the world, right? You're focused on the science, you're focused on the disease, you're focused on the clinical development. You give some thought to commercialization, but that commercialization is pretty much US focused, right? And it's a big world out there, and the US is only one part of it, and it's getting ugly. Right? European prices are coming down, right? And you all know about NICE in the UK. That's, you know, will approve drugs based on their price and the value. Germany has just instituted a system which might be even more draconian than NICE. Most of their other European countries reference Germany in regard to their prices. So it looks like the European prices are going in a direction that is, let's say, not favorable to our industry over the next few years. The developing world, in some sense, can make up for some of that, but a lot of the countries in the developing world reference Europe in their prices. So their prices are likely to decline as well, too. Now, that's not a direct problem for many of you here who work in small companies, but it is a problem because when a larger company comes to you, either to buy the company or to license in one of your products, they'll factor that into the valuation, right? And the valuation will be a little lower than it would have been a few years ago. So these are real issues that affect not only companies that are selling products, but affect the entire industry. You know, pricing pressure, healthcare reform, the global financial situation, financing issues, those are all part of the same big issue. We live in a world where things are financially not as easy as they were a few years ago, and we just have to be realistic about that. All right? So, how do we do that? So there are just a few principles I want to talk about as to how we can continue to be a thriving industry in the face of some of the pressures that we all face. Right? We have to remember that we do good things in this industry, right? That we make the lives of patients better, right? And so for me, what's at the core of everything that we do is do the right thing for patients. If it's right for the patients, it's almost always right for your business, right? These are two young women. They actually are MS patients. They're on an MS walk. Right? And what I want all of us to remember, what I want every employee at Biogen Idec to remember, and what we should all keep in mind, is we're not making the shoes these people are walking in. Right? We're making the drugs that allow them to keep walking. And that's a big difference. they are counting on us, not just MS patients, but patients with a variety of different diseases are counting on us to do the best for them. Right? And doing the best for them is almost always doing what's best for your business. And I'll give you a couple examples of that. And Joe talked about this. Tysabri, I think, is maybe the most interesting, from an intellectual point of view, the most interesting drug in the industry. Right? It was introduced in 2004. The clinical data in the phase 3 trial were spectacular. It was way more efficacious than anything on the market. It's still probably the most efficacious drug out there. Had an incredibly rapid uptake just through the charts. And then it was associated with a devastating neurological disease called PML, progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy, which is a disease that's caused by JC virus. Right? And apparently treatment with Tysabri allowed activation of JC virus and led to an increased frequency of PML. Well, all in, that occurred in about 1 in every 1,000 patients. Right? The drug was pulled from the market, and as Joe said, with cooperation of the patient groups and the FDA and the company, did a wonderful job of getting this drug back on the market. Now, since that time, the company has put a lot of effort into understanding the risk factors associated with the development of PML. And we've identified 3 risk factors so far, the most important of which is whether or not a patient has been infected with JC virus. Right? If you don't have JC virus, you don't get PML. Simple as that. And like a lot of viruses, it can lay quiescence, so it's difficult to test directly for the presence of the virus. But you can test for antibodies to the virus, which reflects prior infection. And so we have, and last year we had approved both in the US and in Europe a test for JC virus antibodies. And that's now on the label in the US and the EU, so we can actually go talk about it. And so if you are JC negative, your chances of getting PML are very low. If you're JC positive, they're higher. If you have JC virus and you have the other 2 risk factors, they're really high. Right? And so the drug is on the market and it's available to all those patient groups, but we have been completely transparent. We publish every case of PML that we know of. We update those numbers monthly. And so it's out there. And this allows patients and physicians to make the appropriate decision for themselves, right, as for the patients as to whether or not they think Tysabri is the appropriate drug for their use. Right? Now, that's absolutely the right thing to do for patients. The drug is available. For some patients, it is an amazingly efficacious drug, and it transforms their lives. Other patients get PML. So patients need to know, and I think this is a great example of how the company worked through a potential problem, keeping in mind what was the right thing to do for the patient community. It's another example we had just last summer. There's a drug on the market here for MS called Ampyra. This is to help walking in MS patients. It was developed by a biotech company in New York called Accorda. We in-licensed the drug from Accorda for ex-US rights, and it actually was rejected in the EU. Right? Now, it's a long story. It's a whole other topic as to why that happened, but we were convinced that that was an inappropriate decision. Of course, there's always the financial things. As a company, you want to sell your drugs. But this was clearly a drug that benefited many of the patients who took it. It did help them to walk better. And the EU regulators made a decision. It wasn't crazy. It wasn't irrational. Based on the information they had, it was probably not the decision I would have made, but it was not an unreasonable decision. We worked with the patient groups in Europe. We work with some of the key opinion leaders in Europe. We worked with many of the communities in Europe. We appealed. In Europe, if your drug is turned down, you get to appeal it. We did appeal. Historically, about 10% of appeals are successful. In this case, and largely through support from patient advocacy groups in Europe, the appeal was successful, and Ampyra is now marketed in Europe, and it is helping thousands of patients there walk better. So those are 2 examples of really keeping in mind what's best for patients. You can imagine when Tysabri is pulled from the market for PML, certainly the legal department would advise you just to put that drug away and move on, right? That was not the right thing to do. The company did the right thing, and I think that's great. One of the other things by putting patients first, and this is also an economic issue, is deliver drugs that address a real need. You know, the days when you can introduce a drug on the market which is 10% better than some generic and charge 10 times as much as the generic are gone. Those days are gone, right? If you want to get a good price for your drug, you'd have to demonstrate that the drug is providing some value to patients. That is absolutely true in all the countries except for the US, and it is increasingly becoming true with the major payers in the US as well. So just as an example of some of those in multiple sclerosis, we have disease-modifying therapies on the market. Other companies have disease-modifying therapies on the market. There are many more disease-modifying therapies in clinical development. The world probably doesn't need more disease-modifying therapies than those that are on the market now and will reach the market in the next few years. What we need are drugs that actually will reverse the course of the disease and repair the disease and stop the disease. And so all of our early R&D is focused not on modifying the disease, but on remyelination, on neuronal repair, on neuroprotection. And so we have several of those candidates in preclinical development, and now we have one about to enter phase 2. So you have to think about where the need is. Secondary progressive multiple sclerosis is, a reasonable fraction of the patients with MS have secondary progressive MS. There's no drug to help those patients. All the drugs that are on the market for MS are for the relapsing remitting form of the disease. There's a real need there. Other neurodegenerative diseases, ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, horrible disease, right? From diagnosis to death in about 3 years, 3 to 5 maybe for some patients. Patients progressively lose muscular control. You know, they can't walk, then they can't move, then they can't breathe, and then they die, right? And all that time, their cognitive function is unimpaired, right? So they're trapped inside this body that no longer does anything that they want it to. It's just a horrible fate. And so we in-licensed a drug, again, from a biotech company called Keynote, which had positive phase 2 data. First positive phase 2 data in maybe 15 years for the drug. It's now in a phase 3 trial. That trial enrolled 900 patients in 4 months. That's the fastest enrolling trial in Biogen's history, Biogen Idec's history. It is it's the fastest enrolling trial I know about. And that really speaks to the desperation of this patient population. Patients were lining up to have this drug. So that trial is fully enrolled. It will read out the end of this year. If it works, then it's a spectacular thing for those patients. Immunology. You know, we just in-licensed a compound, or bought a company actually, Stromedics, to gain access to an antibody to treat idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. Again, that's a very tough disease, nothing to treat it, a lot of patients, incredible need there. We'll see if it works, right? Excuse me. And then I'll talk about hemophilia in a couple of minutes. And, you know, whenever I talk about these things, you know, I get questions about riskiness. Are we putting all of our R&D dollars into things that are incredibly risky? Well, these are risky diseases. There's no getting around that. But this is my CEO simplistic view of when you should address a disease like this. The need stays constant. For a disease like ALS, there's nothing to treat it now. There was nothing to treat it 15 years ago. It's the same. The need is the same. But keep in mind that 15 years ago, there was nothing to treat MS, right? And in the intervening years, there are now several drugs on the market that really do provide a significant benefit to patients with MS. So there is a time when you start to make progress in the disease. And this curve you see here is just my schematic representation of how our understanding of disease processes goes. You know, and they lag for a long time, and then there is an accelerating phase. You saw that happen in oncology a few years ago. The understanding of the basis for cancer really took off a few years ago, and it is still going, right? It's not at the top, it's not on the plateau stage or anywhere near it, but somewhere in the middle of this curve. And so it became possible to develop rational drugs against tumors rather than just simply cytotoxic agents that would kill fast-growing cells. And that's resulted in a lot of good drugs now that are providing real benefit to patients. The same is occurring in a lot of other diseases, including some of those diseases that I just talked about. So we have to focus on those areas where there's a real need. Now, this is something that I feel very strongly the best, and it seems, somewhat harsh to say be the best, work with the best, or get out, right? But I do believe that that's true. We are in a competitive world, right? And none of us can afford to be middle of the road. None of us can afford to be mediocre, right? All of us are really good at some things. None of us are really good at everything, right? So this takes me looking hard in the mirror, right? And asking what your company, what you are really good at, and where you can honestly say, I am world-class at this. My company is world-class at this. And then there'll be other things where you can't say that, and you have to be realistic about it. And then you may need those other areas in order to get your drug onto the market or whatever it is you're developing. Well, then you have to ask yourself, is it realistic to become among the best in that area, or should I work with someone in that area? And increasingly, I think the solution is to work with each other, collaborate, right? And stay focused on what you're really good at. When I got to Biogen Idec, in the summer of 2010, the company is working in 5 disease areas. It's working in neurodegeneration, but it was MS. It was working in autoimmunity. It's working in hemophilia, cardiovascular, and oncology. It isn't nearly a big enough company to be competitive in 5 areas. Not nearly big enough. Pfizer can do that, Roche can do that, Biogen Idec cannot. And so as I went around and reviewed the different areas, it was clear we had to not do everything that we were doing if we were going to be competitive. So as I looked at that, the neurology stuff was amazingly good. We had a world-class team of neuroscientists, of neurologists leading the clinical development. We were on the market there, and we knew how to market to neurologists. That was an area that should stay, right? And so we branched out into other adjacent areas of neurology. ALS is one example of that. But multiple sclerosis is, of course, an autoimmune disease, right? And so the company had developed a lot of expertise over the years on how to deal with autoimmune disease. So that was the other area, and that's a nice, tight, related area of R&D that we can do. That became our focus. We stopped all of the oncology, which unfortunately meant that we closed down our site in Southern California, the old Idec site, but it just didn't make sense to keep that open. If I could have, I would have moved the company headquarters there because that was an amazing facility. But, and it meant getting out of some collaborations we did. There were a lot of hard decisions to make here. But by closing those areas, in areas where I didn't think we were competitive, we were able then to work with greater intensity on those areas where we stayed. Right? And so we were able to carry forward our neurology programs, our immunology programs with critical mass, with expertise. And so we weren't, a mile wide and an inch deep anymore. We were much narrower, much deeper, more focused, more aggressive on those things that we're doing. Right? Biogen Idec also has hemophilia programs. When I came to the company, they seemed like an add-on to me, right? They didn't have any strategic coherence with anything else the company was doing. And so before I went there, my view was, okay, those are the first things we'll get rid of, because they're just an add-on. I figured we could sell them to somebody. But when I got there, hemophilia is a disease that is in need of much better therapies. Before I worked at Exelixis, I worked at Bayer. My last stint at Bayer was in Berkeley. And we got on the market at the time I was there, Cogenate, which was the first recombinant factor VIII for the treatment of hemophilia, and it replaced the blood-derived factors. That was in the early 90s, right? There hasn't been an advance in the treatment of hemophilia since then, right? And so the hemophilia is a genetic disease. It's a clotting disorder. This is not a disease where people just don't bleed if they get a cut. People bleed into their joints, they bleed into their brain. There's serious morbidity and sometimes mortality associated with this disease. In order to avoid that, patients have to inject themselves pretty much every other day with the blood factors. And these injections are intravenous. And this is a lifelong process. And it doesn't take a lot of imagination to imagine what kind of cost that imposes on one's lifestyle. And so we have two factors now, factor 8 and factor 9 for hemophilia A and B, that are fused to the FC region of antibodies. And they last longer, right? They have longer half-lives. So they'll reduce the number of the number of injections that patients have to give themselves. It's a major improvement in the quality of life for these patients should these trials be successful. These are both in phase 3 trials now. They'll read out later this year. Pretty good phase 2 data going into this, so we're reasonably confident about the outcome, although you never know. It ain't over till it's over. But feeling pretty good about these trials. And so to me, this was an example of a little bit of flexibility. You have to be strategic, you have to be focused, but you can't afford to throw away opportunistic things that may fall in your lap. Biosimilars, right? Another very interesting area. Look, the world we live in now is increasingly one where, and certainly healthcare environment over the next decade, where cost pressures will be as big a driver as innovation, right? And so we have to be prepared to work in both of those areas, right? So you've all, I'm sure, heard about biosimilars and read about them. Some of you probably working on them. There's certainly going to be a biosimilar market in the US and around the world, no question about that. The question is when and how, what the regulations will be, what the criteria will be. And although both the FDA and Europe have clarified some of the questions around this, there remain a lot of questions still. In order to compete effectively in biosimilars, one needs a lot of different capabilities. So certainly you need good cell line engineering, process development, manufacturing, analytics. Beyond that, you're going to need very sophisticated clinical development, regulatory skills, and then the marketing is going to be somewhat different from normal pharmaceuticals. So as we looked at Biogen Idec, we saw an opportunity there because we have the first set of those, the cell line engineering, process development, manufacturing, analytics. We are really good at that. We don't have any of the others in sense of biosimilars, and where we do have expertise, it's all taken up on our proprietary products, so we didn't want to divert people's attention. So we were looking for a partner. Last year was an interesting year. Everybody working in biosimilars did a dance looking for partners. It's a new area. No one knows how it's going to evolve. Most people wanted to do this in partnership. So we went around, it was like a big circle, everybody talking to everybody else. We ended up partnering with Samsung. Right? Now, Samsung is, I'm sure known to you for TVs and cell phones, but it's a huge conglomerate company, much like GE or Siemens. And they have a healthcare business. They have made biologicals. They're one of their key corporate strategic goals for the next decade. They are building a large biologicals manufacturing facility outside of Seoul. And they are decided to enter the biologicals market through biosimilars, and so they were looking for a partner. So we entered into a joint venture with Samsung. The joint venture was seeded with $300 million. Right? Samsung put in 255. We put in 45. So they put in 85% of the money. We put in 15% of the money. If the joint venture needs more cash, Samsung will put in the rest of the money. At any time over the next several years, if we want, we can buy our way up to a 50-50 ownership of the joint venture by repaying Samsung what they put in with a reasonable interest rate. So for us, this satisfied all of our needs. We had a partner with deep pockets. We had a partner who was absolutely committed to this. They've hired in some great people. And we have a partner who has made this a key corporate strategy. So this was a way of kind of adapting to the environment as we see it evolving over the few years. This is going to be a real business. If it takes longer, if it's more arduous to get to the market than we think it's going to be, our risk is limited. If it turns out to be a spectacularly successful business, then we'll participate meaningfully in the upside. So this is kind of being opportunistic. Now, this might not be directly applicable to you, but marketing of pharmaceuticals is changing around the world. There's a law being debated in France right now that would make it illegal for sales reps to have one-on-one meetings with doctors. Right? Many other countries are considering similar criteria. That will fundamentally change the way drugs are marketed. At the same time, more and more countries have formal processes that require you to get a price approved by the government in order to get the drug reimbursed. Those are complicated processes. They are semi-rational, and because they're semi-rational because the countries that are deciding how much to pay you have designated committees. And in Germany, for example, the committees are made up of the sick funds. They're made up of the payers. So the payers decide how much they're going to pay you. So this is not exactly a neutral court. Right? And so these are tough situations. And so as we go forward, we have to have more sophistication in how to deal with payers and how to get through those processes and get ourselves the prices that we need in order to sustain the R&D engine that we've had and keep it vibrant. And so we certainly, and all companies are certainly moving in that direction. Let's talk about globalization for a while, because the United States is not the only place that uses drugs. And just for Biogen Idec's point of view, the countries in dark blue here are the ones where we sell directly, where we have subsidiaries that sell the drugs. The ones in light blue are countries where we have distributors, where our drugs are marketed, but through another company with whom we have a relationship. And the countries in gray are those countries where we don't yet market our drugs. And several of those will turn light blue and dark blue over the coming years. So it has to be part of all of our strategy to think globally these days. The emerging markets, places like Turkey, Brazil, it's not just China, but Turkey, Brazil, other countries are now and will become increasingly attractive markets. So we need to be thinking about that. So in the view of working with the best, no company is good at everything. No company has a monopoly on innovation, right? There are smart people all over the place, right? And there's innovation going on all over the place. And so we have to be realistic about this. And just a couple of highlights here. ISIS, a company here in California, developed an antisense construct that is designed to treat a disease called spinal muscular atrophy, SMA. Right? SMA is a devastating disease. It is the most common genetic cause of death in infants. Right? So it comes in various degrees of severity, but in the most severe case, these infants never sit up, they never walk, and they die at 1 or 2 years of age. Right? And this is horrible. Just think about the impact of that on a family. Right? So it's a horrible disease. It's a single gene defect. Comes from a gene called SMA1, right? And it's a defect in that gene. There's a gene called SMA2, which is capable of making the same protein, but which is usually alternatively spliced so that it doesn't, right? And so this construct is designed to alter the splicing pattern of SMA2 so that it makes functional SMA protein and counteract the defect. It works amazingly well in animal models of SMA that have this genetic defect. It's just entered clinical trials. And that, I think it's a very nice relationship with ISIS. They are really good at this. They are very capable of doing the phase 1 clinical trials. They have the connections in the SMA community. So in the view of letting each company do what they're best at, they're doing the early stage clinical development. And so if the early stage development is successful, of course, we'll take it over at some point and do the later stage clinical development. But I think we have a collaboration here that plays to the strengths of each company. You know, academia is interesting. Now, everybody's hurting for money, right? The industry is under tighter financial conditions than it used to be. So is academia. And so the leading universities are also thinking about how they can be involved in drug development. And I think there's certainly a financial motivation there, but there's also a genuine desire on the part of many academics to see some of their work go to some practical good. So, you know, recently we established a collaboration for Harvard. Those of you who remember Exelixis in the early days, we've gone back to our fruit fly studies here, looking at Parkinson's disease. We are signing a second collaboration with a different group at Harvard today, I believe. We'll announce that shortly next week to do some proteomic analysis. We have earmarked this year in our R&D budget $15 million exclusively for academic collaborations. That will increase next year, since we'll have to continue the ones we have this year and establish some new ones next year. Now, why is that? I think it's for a number of different reasons. You know, there are fewer platform technology companies than there used to be. Right? There still are some. You can still get some funded. They do good things, but there are fewer of them. So some platform technologies that 10 years ago would have been in a biotech company are not now, and they are in academic centers. And so we're accessing some of those technologies. In other cases, you know, sophistication with equipment allows an academic lab, if they're adequately funded, to compete reasonably effectively for a focused project with some biotech companies, and frankly, it costs less. And so that's part of the evolving environment. And I think collaboration with academia is not just the purview of companies with money. It's the motivation of the academics is partly money, but partly they want to work with other really good people to advance their work. So there's an opportunity there for everybody to think about these differently. Working together with other companies. PML I talked about for multiple sclerosis. PML is not just an issue with Tysabri or for multiple sclerosis patients. PML is an issue for any patient who's on any immunosuppressive drug. And so there are a number of companies who have an interest in learning how to deal with this disease, maybe finding a treatment for it. And so we are working together with Elan, with Bristol Myers Squibb, with Pfizer, with Roche, to see if we can develop ways to diagnose earlier and treat the disease. So this is about focus. We talked about this a little bit at the beginning. This is another aspect of, I think, excellence here. You can't be doing too many things. You have to do a limited number of things that you can do competitively and do well. So when we got to Biogen Idec, we canceled 17 R&D programs. I did, I think, 9, and then we hired an R&D head who then went through and killed another 8. I'm not saying that in any sense that we're proud of it, but it was difficult. It was not a fun thing to do. But those are programs that we really felt were not competitive. By canceling them, we of course save money, and then we have those resources to put on those programs that are competitive so we can carry them forward in a more aggressive manner. You know, all companies, you know, small companies, it's easy to make decisions, right? You get everybody together in the conference room and the decision's made. And big companies, it's much more cumbersome to do that. So we're kind of in the middle, and so we've redefined our decision-making processes. But for there, and this is one of the decision-making things. And you know, this may be relevant to some of you, not to others. But the question is, when you have a commercial group, you have manufacturing, you have R&D, you have legal, you have compliance, you have a lot of different departments. How do you get them to work well together, to exchange information in real time, and to work cooperatively to achieve the best outcome? A lot of ways to do that, no single solution. What we did at Biogen Idec was to install a very strong program management system where each, we call them program executive, is essentially given the purview of being the CEO of their project. So they have on their team representatives from each of those departments, the lead commercial person, the lead R&D person, senior person in manufacturing, and it is their responsibility to formulate, it's not their responsibility to formulate the strategy, but to make sure that a good strategy is formulated. Not their job to make decisions. The job is to make sure that good decisions get made in a timely manner and that the execution is carried out. And if there are issues with the project, and there always are, that those issues are flagged early enough so that we can do something about them before we get in trouble. This has worked incredibly well, I would say, in the time that I've been there. And finally, I just want to close on this, culture. Right? And you know, as I've been reading about this and thinking about this, you know, there's a saying that says, culture eats strategy for lunch. Right? And I believe that that's true, actually. You know, the best strategy in the world isn't worth anything if you don't execute it. Right? And if you have the right people and the right culture and a bad strategy, you'll figure it out that it's a bad strategy and fix it. And so, in the end, success is about people and culture. Right? And you know, this catchphrase at the bottom here, care deeply, work fearlessly, change lives. I'm a little self-conscious about that because it's, you know, after having all those years at Exelixis, it seems a little big company-ish to me to have a little catchphrase like that. But it's meaningful to people, and those are not words that were chosen thoughtlessly. And this is what we've tried to build our culture around, about caring for patients, really caring for patients. We have patient groups come in and talk to our employees. That's incredibly motivating. Right? It's great for the patients. It's great for the employees. Working fearlessly, you know, means don't be afraid to speak up. It means thinking out of the box. It means trying things, taking risks, not being afraid to do things a little differently. It's a changing world. It's a challenging world. We're going to have to do things a little differently. And changing lives is what we're all here to do. So I think with that, I will stop. And I think we can take some questions, or what are we doing, Joe? Go ahead.
All right. First of all, thanks. And we still love you down in Southern California, so feel free to come and visit. It's safe. I've got a few questions here, and I've got a few questions of my own, but please feel free to continue to put your questions down, and we'll get them up here to George. First thing, George, I'm curious. Biogen Idec, Amgen, Genentech, some of the giants of the biotech industry have been around for a while. Listening to your presentation and thinking about companies focusing on their strengths and collaborations, are we going to see any more Biogen Idecs and Amgens in the future?
Oh, that's a tough question. Yeah, I think we will. I think we will. I mean, you know, take Vertex as an example. You know, there's a company that's had some real success. And we'll see where they go. I mean, they could get bought and not have the opportunity to develop, but I think they're certainly on a trajectory that could get them there. I mean, Celgene is a younger company than those, but it's made it into that same class of companies. So yeah, it's possible.
You've had the opportunity to see things from the smaller biotech side, although Exelixis was a fairly large biotech company, and the Biogen Idec side. I've heard people say, you know, there's maybe an ideal relationship between biotech companies and larger biotechs or big pharmas, one where, you know, the biotechs focus on the earlier stage stuff and the larger company focuses on the later stage stuff. Listening to you today, though, I don't really hear that. I hear that there's a more level playing field, or there should be.
I think it's more complicated than that, right? And, you know, because if you really look at yourself critically, you know, big pharma companies aren't good at I mean, they're in general great at late-stage clinical development, but not every company is good in clinical development in every disease area. Sometimes a biotech company will have as much expertise there or more. Pharma companies are, it's interesting to me that a lot of smart people work in pharma companies and big companies, and yet their productivity is not what they need it to be. And part of that is that they don't have excellence throughout, and things can get bogged down in those areas where they're maybe not so good. And part of it is just by virtue of being big, things slow down. So if companies are realistic and match themselves up right and develop a collaboration that incentivizes both companies and gives them the same incentives, right? So they're not working at cross purposes, then I think there are any number of structures that can work. I think it's, look, in all these we need a lot of collaborations at Exelixis, and we signed a few since I've been at Biogen Idec. And there are some hallmarks, I think, that distinguish successful collaborations from unsuccessful. And it's not the late, early division. It's really the incentives, right? And what's going to happen a few years into the program? And will the biotech company still have the same incentives as a pharma company and vice versa? And as a small company, you always structure these collaborations so that there are milestone payments at certain stages. Those milestone payments will be factored into decisions the big company makes as they decide whether to move those things forward or not. And they're not make or break things, but when they think about whether to move an internal project forward without those payments or this project forward with those payments, those things matter. And so thinking about how to structure the collaborations in a way that makes sense for everybody, I think is, and we didn't think about that enough when I was at Exelixis. But
things have truly changed, though, from the standpoint that early stage companies back in the 90s, and I think John Crowley talked yesterday a little bit about how easy it was to get funding in the 90s for just about anything, and today how difficult it would be. And early stage companies face, as you said, tremendous challenges. Everybody does today. The venture capital world isn't what it used to be. The IPO market isn't what it used to be. You're saying we're seeing more, of course, of the platform technology work going to the universities and the research institutes. When you look back at Exelixis and you look at small companies today and the kinds of challenges they face, what are the best kinds of approaches that they can take from an early stage to move forward through this? I think we've called it the valley of death in the past. I don't know if it still is or not. But.
Well, I think what's happened is that biotech's moved into the real world, right? That the 90s were just an exception from normal behavior, right? And when Exelixis went public, we were a fruit fly company. We were doing Drosophila genetics, and that's just not possible today. And then we got to be a $2 billion market cap company, just for a moment, but we did, based on a fruit fly company. Right? That's not realistic. There's no way that a fruit fly company can justify that kind of valuation. It did at the time because of all the overexuberance around all the genomic field. So today, one has to have a realistic business case, right? Of demonstrating with some realism that the money invested actually has a reasonable chance to generate a return. It's a risky business. A lot of things will fail. We all know that, but it has to be within the realm of what's reasonable and thoughtful. So I think focus on one, a realistic business model of where the money's going to come from, when and where things will be partnered or sold, and what that's going to mean. Right? So it's tougher these days if you're a small company and you sign a collaboration and you get some money up front, what you've done is de-risk it for yourself, right? You've shifted the cost and the risk of the development onto a partner. You've gotten some money in the early stage. Sometimes you need that money just to keep the company running. I think the question is, what are you going to do with that money? Right? And are you going to, what are you going to invest it in? And is that further investment really merit putting that kind of money into it? If you were an outside investor, would you put that money into it? And so that might lead to some different kinds of business models, right?
We see a lot of that money going into physical plant, into hiring people across the board, but that's not where the money's going anymore, right?
Yeah, well, the money, often goes into earlier projects, so you can have the next thing coming down the pike. And, it's hard to make a drug, right? Not many companies actually succeed in making drugs, and way fewer succeed in making 2 drugs. And so if you have a drug that looks like it's a success, and if you partner that drug or what you do and you get some money, and I think you have to be realistic about whether or not your next investment is likely to be equally profitable.
Ready for some questions?
Sure.
Okay. All right.
I have a question from the floor. I'm an academic neurologist from the region, and I'm interested in Tysabri. And of course, you mentioned the problems, and I think you handled the crisis very beautifully, at least as we can tell from the outside. But I wonder what the feeling is from your industry on the timing of drug release. Is the FDA holding drugs back too much, or do they let drugs like Tysabri on the market too early and then wait for post-market reporting?
Yeah, good question. I don't know anybody who thinks the FDA is releasing drugs too early. Let me put it that way. And there is a risk aversion in the FDA, right? And the risk aversion, I think, it's not an FDA problem, it's a congressional problem, right? If you're an FDA reviewer and you're going to get hauled before some congressional committee if a drug you approve is subsequently found to have some adverse events, adverse effects, then your natural tendency is to be somewhat conservative. Now, there's a new PDUFA bill being negotiated now, and in that there is currently some language that would encourage the FDA to use accelerated approval for drugs to treat diseases where there's an urgent unmet need, and to use even surrogate markers if they're reasonably predictive of a clinical benefit. So hopefully there'll be a route fairly soon, if this actually gets incorporated into the final language, that would encourage the FDA to approve certain classes of drugs a little earlier.
Thank you.
You want to just to expand on that? Do you want to talk a little bit more about the role of patients in the FDA review process?
Yeah, look, I think let's talk about ALS, because we have as I mentioned in my talk, we have a phase 3 drug for ALS. There's one drug on the market to treat the disease called Reordering. It's been on the market for 15 years. It provides, at best, a marginal benefit. Right? And only about half the patients get it because a large number of neurologists don't feel that it provides any benefit at all. It's a devastating disease. We had so many requests for patients to get into our trial. This was a trial, we were supposed to enroll 800 and some odd patients in this trial, but by the time we closed it, and we had patients were pouring in, and we ultimately ended up enrolling 942 patients. We then had letters from many patients expressing their outrage at being excluded from the trial. And so there's a real need, not just in ALS, I'm just using that as an example. If we suppose that trial's positive, right? And it could be negative, and that's the end. But that trial is positive, and we report that the trial met its outcomes. Then every ALS patient will want to have access to that drug, right? And they won't want to wait 2 years while it goes through a normal process. And so those advocacy groups, and we won't have to do anything to encourage them. They'll be there themselves, and they'll be wanting to get the drug. So I think those things have a real impact. The MS patients were incredibly important in getting Tysabri reintroduced onto the market and in getting Fampyra approved in Europe. So The patient advocacy groups are, I think, are doing a great job in representing the needs of their patients. Right? And if we or any other company has a drug that truly benefits those patients, then those advocacy groups, then our interests are aligned with theirs, and they can be very helpful. Right?
There's a rousing discussion yesterday in our opening session between patient advocacy and FDA in terms of the extent to which patient advocacy groups should be able to advise the FDA on how much risk to accept versus benefit in approving a drug.
Yeah. You know, I don't know the answer to that one. Look, for a drug, and maybe there are different kinds of approvals, right? Depending on the need. Certain, diseases that are fatal in a very short period of time maybe can have a different standard from high blood pressure, right? Or elevated lipid levels. If you're going to die in 2 years, maybe you're not quite as worried about the side effects as you are if you're going to die in 50 years or 30 years, right? And so I think there's a rational basis for thinking differently about those kinds of diseases. Hopefully that's what this PDUFA language does. Right?
Do you have a question from the floor?
Right.
George, I have a question, but I have a comment. I noticed your sniffles, and I just remember the movie Contagion started that way, so I just hope it's that way. So I just had a quick question. A lot of barriers to success, the science itself, the cost leading to reimbursement, the FDA. Is it a fair statement to say that part of the problem of finding enough drugs that actually work is actually in the drug discovery tools themselves? Are we trying to dig a coal mine with a teaspoon, in effect? Is that still a barrier in your mind to efficient discovery and also efficient failure of ones that aren't going to make it?
Yeah, I think the biggest limitation on making drugs is understanding of the biology of the diseases. Right? That if you have good insight into what a target might be or what the mechanisms of a disease are, in many cases you can start to formulate therapeutic approaches. Now, there are, if you have a disease that results from a single gene defect, and so you're just missing something, that's a much harder program if you have to replace that. If it's a biochemical pathway that somehow is disturbed, that you can work around, then it's often easier. So number one, I think it's the biology that's key. And also and I think this is true now, what we're doing, I think almost every company is doing now, is in phase 1 trials now, you used to get PK data. You'd see how much was your drug bioavailable or not, what was its half-life, maybe you get some tissue distribution data, and that's it. Right? And then you had to make your decision to go into phase 2, basically knowing nothing but that. And these days we don't take anything into the clinic unless we have biomarkers for it. And so unless we're able to, in those phase 1 studies, understand if the drug gets to its target, if it's modulating its target, and whether that target modulation is likely to impact a physiological process in the way we'd like it to. So, and if they don't do that, we kill them. Right? And so you kill them right then. And so that's to your, failing quick part of the question. But that's also based on an understanding of the biology of what those biomarkers might be. So I think that's really the rate limiting step.
Got a couple of questions here that people have submitted. One, open innovation is a key buzzword. Biogen Idec's had deep experience in immunology and neurology. Are you sharing this expertise with industry and or disease foundation partners, and if so, how?
Would you repeat that? I'm sorry. I am a little stuffed up here.
Open innovation is a key buzzword. Okay. Biogen Idec's had deep experience in immunology and neurology. Are you sharing this experience in working with patient groups, and how are you doing that?
Yeah, we share a lot of our experience. I think people tend to overvalue their proprietary information. And there's some proprietary information that's truly proprietary, and we don't share that, of course. All companies do that. But there's a lot of information that we, would have kept proprietary a few years ago that we probably don't now. We had a collaboration with UCSF where we, UCSF actually, with our participation, sequenced the genomes of 500 MS patients and followed them longitudinally over 5 years, right, to see the rate at each patient progressed and what drugs they responded to or didn't respond to. And the hope was to feed that all back into being able to make some predictions from the genomic data. And of course, 500 patients aren't nearly enough. MS is a very complicated disease genetically. And so you probably need 5,000. And so we're doing that. And that will involve multiple academic institutions. And we'll all have to share the data. We have a huge amount of patient data, right, in our archives that we'll have to share as well. And that's not a proprietary question. That's a legal question, a confidentiality question for the patients. But all of that can be worked out. Yeah.
Steve Walker, I was up there yesterday. I'm the patient advocate. In 2009, we seemed to have a real breakdown in communication between a biotech company and the FDA with the drug Zelboraf. We came out of phase 1 and an extension with astounding results and very solid understanding of the biology of the disease, cause and effect relationship. The FDA fell down, essentially, and insisted on a traditional development program, which resulted in a phase 3 trial that I think most of us felt, including the developer, Genentech, shouldn't have been run because it was unethical and unnecessary. So in your dealings with the FDA since that time and talking about the knowledge of biology of disease, are you seeing a shift in thinking and maybe an understanding among review staff that the cause and effect relationship is extremely important and perhaps sometimes more important in terms of decision making than the statistics?
Yeah, that's a very complicated question. And again, I'll come back to our ALS study. There's a futility analysis built into the study. Right? And of course, the futility analysis can cause you to stop the study if you have no chance of success. In many cases, it can cause you to stop the study if you've already demonstrated statistically significant results for your drug. In this case, it's one-sided, right? We can only stop for failure, not for success. And that's after a lot of discussions with the FDA, who basically took the position, and it's not an unreasonable position, that this is the only chance they'll get. If this drug is positive, this is the only time they'll get to do a trial for the drug. And they want to see what the drug does over at least a year period. Showing some benefit over 6 months, 3 months, in their view, is not sufficient. So, that's the position they took, comes to kind of the same issue. So you have to balance, the need and to get the drug to patients earlier, the ethics of, putting patients on a trial, some of whom will get placebo if you have a drug and you're already fairly sure that it works, versus really knowing that the drug works, really understanding its safety profile. And the fact that once the drug gets on the market, very difficult to do another controlled trial.
See other questions from the floor there? Okay. I've got another one here. Insight into disease biology allows a more targeted approach to drug discovery and reduces technology risk. However, does this also mean more competitors enter the market, resulting in a reduced return? Is there a point when it's too late to jump on the bandwagon?
Oh, yeah, definitely there's a point where it's too late to jump on the bandwagon. Look, it is interesting that as insights get developed into disease processes, they seem to come from multiple places at once, and many companies jump on the same bandwagon. So if you look at oncology now, any of the really interesting targets, there are multiple compounds in development, and sure, there's a lot of competition. And so in that situation, you have to be realistic. And this happened in the oncology programs at Biogen Idec. They were almost all focused on well-known targets that are good targets, right? They can lead to good drugs. They were almost all some years behind the competition, and they were, in most cases, only hand-waving reasons why we were going to be best in class, because if you're not first in class, you obviously want to be best in class. And so there comes a point where you have to, the people working on the project love the project. They're advocates for the project. It's their work, it's their baby. They, of course, want to keep it going, right? But somebody has to take a cold look at this and say, is this really, are there reasons for believing that they're going to be best and better than all the others, really well-founded? What data do we have to say that that may be true? Or what data are lacking? And how much of this is just, hope and prayers? And if it's hope and prayers, you're better off not spending money on that project. So yes, there comes a time when it's too late. I think speed is important, right? That, as insights get developed, and you need to jump on those quickly, right, to be competitive. But also, I think there are examples where you can get competitive insights into the biology earlier than other people, and that's the reason for doing the internal R&D and in some collaborations that we do, that if you have some insight maybe a year or two before other people get it, then puts you in a great position. Right?
There we go. This afternoon we're going to hear about our state, and when you were introduced, it was mentioned that you were talking about what an exciting, robust community in this business exists in Boston and Cambridge. So I was wondering if you could speak a little to this state's position relative to other competitors.
Yeah, look, this is, I believe, still the leading state for the biotech industry, between San Francisco and Southern California, San Diego area. I think that the disadvantage the state has, aside from the state and all the issues that the state has, is that the industry tends to be spread out, right? That if, the Bay Area stretches all the way from, Berkeley or north of Berkeley down to Palo Alto. That's a big area. And, in Southern California, you have the same geographic spread. In Massachusetts, it's Cambridge. And, a few companies have migrated out to surrounding towns, but it's Cambridge. And, at Exelixis here, I'm sure there are a lot of people here who work in companies that share the same parking lot as Exelixis. That's kind of a nice nucleus. In Cambridge, I can walk to probably 50 other biotech companies. I could walk to Harvard, I can walk to MIT. And so there's a vibrancy there, the Novartis and Sanofi, Pfizer, Merck, all have opened R&D centers there. So there's a big pharma influx as well. That gives that particular place a real vibrancy at the moment. I think in order to be successful, why is California so successful with this? There's an entrepreneurial spirit here, I think more than in other parts of the country, and there are great universities here. And those are the two things you need. And then over the years, the infrastructure is built up, the venture capitalists are here, there's financing here, there's an infrastructure to support the industry. And that's not better anywhere else than it is here. And so I think, we just have to be aware that this is not the only place anymore to do biotech. It is a great place to do it. It is probably still the best place to do it, but other regions are catching up.
Yesterday we had folks here from China Medical City in Taizhou, and I know that Biogen Idec has a presence in China. What's your perspective on just continuing on this in this vein of competition and collaboration in California? What's your perspective on the opportunities in China?
Oh, look, I think the opportunities in the developing world are huge. China in particular, look, some of the things are obvious. A lot of people in China, right? And, there's an emerging middle class there that can increasingly pay for drugs. But introducing drugs in China as a self-pay thing, where the government doesn't reimburse them, is a questionable economic undertaking. So one has to get reimbursement not only the national government, but the provincial governments and the local hospitals, and it's very complicated. China's kind of like Europe, you know, where each of the provinces is kind of semi-autonomous. They have a centralized approval process, but then pricing and access is negotiated on a more local level. And they are not interested in all of the same drugs that we are, right? And so they're like, just taking our pipeline, for example, Avonex, which is our leading drug for MS, they're not interested in that. It's an interferon. They don't think the interferons are that useful. They don't like any of the first-line drugs that are approved here in the Western world. You know, we have a phase 3 trial. We'll probably introduce it there next year, but there's not a lot of excitement about that. Our hemophilia products, they seem to be extremely excited about. The ALS drug, they seem to be extremely excited about. So, you know, we have it now as part of our strategy to do global trials that include patients in China, and so that we can register our drugs there. And we will do so for those drugs that are, let's say, for which we can get reasonable reimbursement from the government. You know, and China is also, you know, their healthcare system is emerging, and it's different in different parts of the country. The big cities, Shanghai, Beijing, a few others, have their own kind of healthcare system, and they will reimburse drugs at a higher rate than the provinces. And so they have access to different drugs than the people in the provinces do. For the first time this year, China has rolled out health insurance for everybody, but that's really minimal. It provides basically people in the countryside with generic antibiotics if they get some infection. So over time, I think that will change, and it has to. I think that, you know, given all the information available now, the Chinese people will want access to the same drugs that the rest of the world has access to. So it is a big part of our strategy.
We have time for, do we have any other questions? No? All right. I think we've exhausted all of it. George, I know you've been a little bit under the weather. First of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to come out here, but this has been a real privilege and a real treat to have you up here talking with us. Thank you so much.